Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving headfirst into a topic that's absolutely crucial in cybersecurity today. And it's something that's really been on my mind lately too, and that's all the different devices that are connecting to our networks.
Yeah, it's a huge topic. It seems like everything is connected these days.
Exactly. And that whole idea of having a secure perimeter, it just doesn't cut it anymore.
It really doesn't.
Yeah.
The way we approach security has to evolve because the landscape itself has completely changed.
Yeah.
We can't just focus on building walls around our networks anymore.
So let's get right into it. What we really want to unpack today is, what exactly do we even mean when we say endpoint in this new world?
Right.
And why is securing all these endpoints so incredibly important?
Yeah.
And then we also want to explore how organizations are actually tackling this challenge, especially because the lines between our personal devices and our work devices, they're just getting blurrier and blurrier all the time.
Absolutely. And that blurring is a big part of what makes this so challenging.
So let's start with the basics. When we talk about endpoints, it's not just about the typical computers we see in an office setting, right? It's way more than that.
It is. We have to think much more broadly.
Let's start with the hardware. So obviously we have servers, and it's interesting to me how often servers are kind of left out of the conversation when we talk about endpoint security.
You're right. People tend to think of servers as this separate category. They're behind the scenes, and people think about network security protecting them. But it's a mistake to think of them as any less vulnerable than a laptop or a phone.
Yeah.
They're just another type of computing platform on the network, and they need the same level of security attention. In fact, because servers often hold sensitive data, they can be even more attractive targets for attackers.
That makes a lot of sense.
And if an attacker does manage to compromise a server, they can then use that as a base to move laterally within the network and potentially gain access to even more sensitive information.
So it's really about understanding that everything that's connected to the network needs to be protected.
Exactly.
Okay, so then you've got your desktops and laptops, which are kind of the classic endpoints we think of.
Right.
And then you have mobile devices, smartphones, tablets, all of that. And this is where things start to get really interesting because now we're entering the world of the Internet of Things.
IoT.
Yeah, the IoT is a whole other ballgame. We're talking about everything from smart home devices like thermostats and security cameras to industrial sensors and medical equipment.
It's mind-boggling to think about how many devices are now connected to the internet, and the sheer variety of those devices is incredible. And, I was reading that article you sent about how attackers are increasingly targeting home routers.
Oh, that's a big one, which is kind of scary because most people don't even think of their router as a potential security vulnerability. They just plug it in and forget about it.
It's the entry point for everything else in your home, often.
Exactly. And then your notes also mentioned this blurring of lines between business use and personal use. And I think this is something everyone can relate to.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, how many people do you know who still have a separate work phone?
Very few these days.
Everyone is using their personal smartphones for work emails, for checking in on projects, for all sorts of things.
Right. And that means that our personal devices are now effectively extensions of the corporate network.
And that creates a whole new set of challenges for organizations that are trying to manage security because they don't have the same level of control over those personal devices.
And that's where things get tricky.
So we've established that the definition of an endpoint is much broader than it used to be. We're not just talking about computers anymore. We're talking about anything and everything that can connect to a network. So why is this such a big challenge from a security perspective?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is simply the sheer diversity of all these endpoints. We have different types of hardware, different operating systems, different applications, and different ways that these devices are being used.
It's almost like trying to manage a zoo with all different kinds of animals. Each one has its own unique needs and vulnerabilities.
That's a great analogy.
You can't just apply a one-size-fits-all approach to security in this kind of environment. And the materials you shared really emphasize this idea of complexity being the enemy of security.
Absolutely. The more complex your environment, the more difficult it becomes to secure it effectively. And this complexity comes from a number of different factors.
Like what?
Well, first of all, you have the sheer number of devices, as we've already discussed. Right. But then you also have the variety of operating systems. You've got your Windows, your Mac OS, your Linux, your iOS, your Android, and countless others. And each of these operating systems has its own unique security vulnerabilities and requires different approaches to patching and management.
And then on top of that, you've got all the different applications that are running on these devices and the data that's being stored on them. It's just a massive amount of information to try and keep track of and secure.
And this complexity leads to a number of problems. It makes it difficult to implement consistent security policies across all devices.
Hmm?
It creates blind spots where attackers can hide,
Yeah.
and it makes it much harder to detect and respond to threats quickly.
So given all of this complexity, how are organizations typically approaching endpoint security?
Well, traditionally, organizations have taken a very siloed approach to security. They might have one team responsible for securing servers, another team for desktops and laptops, and another for mobile devices.
Right, it's like everyone's working their own little bubble.
Exactly. And the problem with this approach is that it creates a lack of visibility and coordination. The server team might not know what's happening on the mobile devices that are connecting to their systems, and the mobile device team might not be aware of the latest vulnerabilities that have been discovered in a particular operating system. So this siloed approach can really undermine your security posture.
So what's the alternative? What would a better approach look like?
Well, best practices suggest that organizations need to move towards a more holistic approach to endpoint security. This means managing all endpoints from a single platform and having a unified view of all the devices and the security risks they pose.
So it's like having a central command center where you can see everything that's happening across your entire network.
Exactly. And from this central command center, you can then implement consistent security policies, monitor for threats, and respond to incidents more effectively.
So what are some of the key benefits of taking this more holistic approach to endpoint security?
Well, as we've already touched on, one of the biggest benefits is improved visibility. When you have a single view of all your endpoints, you can see what devices are connected, what software they're running, what data they're accessing, and whether they're compliant with your security policies. And this improved visibility gives you much better control over your security posture. You can quickly identify and remediate vulnerabilities, and you can detect and respond to threats more effectively.
So it's really about being proactive rather than reactive.
Exactly.
And I imagine that this kind of holistic approach can also save organizations a lot of time and money in the long run.
Absolutely. When you're managing all your endpoints from a single platform, you can automate a lot of the tasks that used to be done manually. And this can free up your IT staff to focus on more strategic initiatives.
Okay, so let's get into some specifics. What are some of the essential security controls that organizations should have in place for all of their endpoints?
Sure. So first and foremost, you need to know what devices are connected to your network. This is known as device discovery. You need to have a way to identify all the devices that are accessing your systems, whether they're company-owned or personal devices.
Right. You can't secure what you don't know about.
Exactly. And once you know what devices are connected, you need to have a way to control what they're allowed to do. This is where acceptable use policies come in.
So these policies would outline things like what types of devices are allowed to connect to the network, what applications they're allowed to use, and what data they're allowed to access.
Exactly. And you also need to have strong password policies in place. This means requiring users to create strong passwords that are a certain length and complexity and requiring them to change their passwords regularly.
And then there's patching. This is one of the most basic, but also one of the most important security controls.
It's so important.
You need to make sure that all your devices are running the latest security updates.
Absolutely. Patching is essential for closing known vulnerabilities that attackers could exploit. And it's not just about patching operating systems. You also need to make sure that all the applications running on your devices are patched as well.
Right. And what about data encryption?
Data encryption is another crucial security control. You should encrypt all sensitive data that's stored on your devices.
So even if a device is lost or stolen, the data on it will be protected.
Exactly. And in addition to data encryption, you should also have a remote wipe capability in place. This will allow you to erase all the data on a device if it's lost or stolen.
And then there's antivirus and endpoint detection and response, EDR.
Right. Antivirus and EDR are essential for preventing and detecting malware and other malicious activity on your endpoints. Antivirus helps protect against known threats,
Yeah.
and EDR helps detect and respond to unknown threats and more sophisticated attacks.
And then finally, you need to have a secure device disposal policy in place. This means having a process for securely wiping all data from a device before you get rid of it.
You don't want your old devices ending up in the wrong hands with sensitive data still on them.
So it's a pretty comprehensive set of security controls that organizations need to have in place.
It is, but when you consider what's at stake, it's absolutely essential.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about bring your own device, BYOD. This is something that's become increasingly common in the workplace.
It has.
And it presents a whole new set of challenges for security professionals.
It really does. When employees are bringing their own devices to work, you're essentially extending your network to include those devices. And you don't have the same level of control over those devices as you do over company-owned devices.
So how can organizations manage the security risks of BYOD?
Well, the first step is to have a clear BYOD policy in place.
Right.
This policy should outline the rules and responsibilities for employees who are using their own devices for work purposes.
So things like what types of devices are allowed, what security software is required, and what data can be accessed on those devices.
Exactly. And you also need to make sure that employees understand the risks of using their own devices for work and that they're taking steps to protect their devices and the data on them.
So things like using strong passwords, being careful about what links they click on, and not connecting to public Wi-Fi networks.
Right. And you also need to make sure that you have the right security tools in place to manage and secure BYOD devices. This might include mobile device management, MDM software, which allows you to remotely manage and secure mobile devices.
Yeah.
And it might also include containerization solutions, which allow you to create a separate secure space on a device for work-related data and applications.
So with all of this in mind, what are some of the key takeaways that we should leave our listeners with today?
I think the most important takeaway is that endpoint security is more important than ever. With the proliferation of devices and the blurring of lines between work and personal use, organizations need to take a holistic approach to endpoint security.
Right. It's not enough to just focus on securing traditional endpoints like desktops and laptops. You need to consider all the devices that are connecting to your network, and you need to manage them from a single platform.
And you need to have a clear BYOD policy in place if you're allowing employees to use their own devices for work.
So I'd like to leave our listeners with a bit of a thought experiment. Think about all the different devices that you use in your daily life, both for work and for personal use.
Yeah, think about it.
How many of those devices could be considered endpoints? And what implications does that have for your own personal security and the security of the organizations you work with or interact with?
It's something we all need to be thinking about.
The world is becoming increasingly interconnected, and endpoint security is only going to become more challenging in the years to come. So stay informed, stay vigilant, and take the necessary steps to protect yourself and your organization.
Great advice.
Thanks for listening.